today we're really going to be talking about the symbiotic relationship between clinical registries and OHDSI. And today we have a great lineup of speakers, and we're only going to be presenting 2 registries, but we're really going to talk about how OHDSI can benefit the registries through EMR automation and through standardization, as well as how the registries can actually benefit OHDSI as a community as well. And so this is something I'm really excited about in this process, and I feel is an enormous opportunity. And so I'm going to state, and here I couldn't find a bigger font that fit the page, that OHDSI presents and the opportunity to lower the cost of clinical registries by orders of magnitude through standardization and EHR automation. And so what are we talking about? Clinical registries, there are hundreds of them where they collect data about patients about a particular disease, trying to study their outcomes. These are an important part of our biomedical discovery process. We have many hundred throughout the US, and there are even more throughout the world. And the challenge is these clinical registries are still mostly living in the 1990s. And what do I mean by that is that clinical registries almost have a high dependence upon humans and human ability to do chart abstraction on clinical data. So here was an analysis that was done, and I got this slide from John Duke, around it takes a half an FTE to collect data on 200 to 300 patients for a clinical registry. And so just think of the enormous cost it takes to collect data on patients around a disease, around having a type of a transplant, or receiving a medication. And so in comparison, I have roughly 2 FTEs for the 2.6 million patients that I have within our OMOP data set here at Johns Hopkins. And so really today is going to be discussing how do we take advantage of the OHDSI way, how do we learn from clinical registries, and how are we going to be able to help modify or help manual registries move over into an automated fashion. And that's really what we're excited about talking about. I'm really grateful to Tina for reconvening the Clinical Registry Working Group, and I really encourage many people to join it, because if you look at this, for hundreds of registries, and these registries often have about at least 10 sites, so we're talking about thousands of site implementations of registries. We're really talking about tens of thousands of FTEs of people that are helping collect data for clinical registries. And this is a real burden on our health system. A lot of these people have to understand the context of the medical record. So some of them might be a nurse or a physician, and I really am on a quest to help lighten their load. We're seeing a lot of burnout from medical professionals right now, and this is what I would consider potentially non-value added tasks that we can take advantage of EHR data for. And so this has really been an exciting quest for mine. And what we've seen is preliminary studies have shown there's a lot of compatibility with the OMOP common data model. Its flexibility in semantics and in structure that we can be used pretty compliantly with CDISC or clinical trials as well, and is a fairly flexible data collection tool for clinical registries. And so there still needs to be more work to be done, but this is something that is a really exciting opportunity that we can really help disrupt or transform a field to really radically improve both the quantity of data being collected and the efficiency with which that data is being collected. And so one of the exciting things I wanted to share is we found a great partner in the FDA who shares our goals in trying to take advantage of this new field. How can we explore it? And so we've joined the Cure ID registry, which is around COVID-19, being led by the FDA in conjunction with the NIH, NCATS, and Critical Path. But the real exciting thing is they're, of course, looking for repurposing drug candidates to treat infectious disease. This started as a traditional registry where clinicians would enter case reports. And we got a lot of investment from the FDA and Cure ID to say, how can we take advantage of automated extraction data from EHR records? How can we invest in lowering the cost of that ETL process with the goal of even trying to be able to reach community hospitals. And so this has been a really exciting registry, and I'm really happy to report that registries can contribute back into OHDSI and help the whole field move forward. And in particular, we came up with 3 goals. And our real quest is making OMOP accessible to community hospitals that have got low technical resources, aren't able to deploy the OHDSI tool stack. And so this is where most care is being delivered in the US. And so we really want to make sure that they're accessible for clinical registries. So our goals were, one was to create a feasibility checklist for clinical registries to see how feasible it is to adopt the OMOP data model. The second one was actually, can we lower the cost to ETL, EHR data into the OMOP format? I don't know if anyone here knows what the standard going rate is for OMOPing your EHR data, but if you talk to most consultants, it's usually around $150,000. And this is usually a burden that's really can't really well be justified by one registry, but when you start doing this as a standard for multiple registries, it can be really valuable. And then, can we also make it easier to deploy the OHDSI tool stack into a secure health system environment? So often when I start working with health systems, I find they've deployed OMOP and they've converted their data to OMOP for a registry like NIH All of Us or the N3C, and yet they're really not using they're not using Atlas, they're not using DQD, they're not in getting what I consider some of the major value that they can get out of OHDSI because they're not able to deploy the tool stack. And so some of this was because of their enterprise security constraints. Some of this is tied to just not having the technical resources to do this. But our goals are, can we lower the barriers for ETL for OMOP, as well as lowering the burden on deploying the OHDSI tool stack into a secure health system? So that's really what we're going to be talking about today. Our first one was a feasibility checklist for clinical registries, and it is as you would think. So it starts off with how many of the data elements in the registry correspond to core OMOP concepts, and a lot of them typically do. They're looking for medications and labs and procedures, conditions and devices, visit types for inpatients versus outpatients, and so we found, in several that we've surveyed, that a good majority of the data elements are actually pretty much out of the box in the OHDSI data model, but generally not all of them. And then there will be things like there's some data elements that will need custom transformation scripts. A lot of data in an EHR is in a flow sheet or in a form somewhere, and that like vitals and smart data elements. And so custom scripts need to be developed to bring that data over. And then often with a registry, they might come up with custom concepts as well. And so we know the OMOP data model allows you to have custom concepts, but it requires coordination between multiple sites around a registry so that they're able to be consistent and figure out ways to have those questions added into a standardized lexicon. And then it gets more exciting it gets more involved when you say, what if they need to extend the OMOP data model to support the registry? And this could be like wanting to include imaging features or other types of aspects or relationships that are not typically in the OMOP data model. We didn't see this. We haven't seen too many registries needing to extend the registry to extend the OMOP data model. But this certainly requires a little bit more effort. And then lastly, we do see how many data elements really will require NLP of a chart review. An example will be symptoms at time of admission for COVID. And these things do require a natural language processing environment. And what I'm excited is today we're going to share our efforts with CureID and N3C. But I'm hoping that we can come back and continue this conversation and show where we're working with the CDC and the great team at Georgia Tech on deploying NLP to go after even more complex features and questions out of narrative notes. And so I think this is really the checklist you want to go through if you're a registry and say, why are we not using OMOP? And I really would like them to be asking that question, because if they can move to OMOP, they get so many advantages out of it. They reduce the cost they can able to then harness data directly from their sites. And so when the new registry comes to Hopkins, I push this at them saying, tell me why I can't use OMOP, because I've done all this work in mapping my data to OMOP, and I don't want to do an end mapping for every registry that comes out that wants to collect data. It's just too expensive for us. And so we found this is our first thing, that a simple guide for seeing whether we need what feasibility for mapping it to the OMOP model. And I do feel I have met very few registries that actually go into needing an extension, or even some of them needing NLP. I think that's really where I think the first three, we found a lot of registries can be captured in that. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. And so my first speaker is Matt Robinson, and Dr. Robinson is an infectious disease physician at JHU. He's been helping me lead these efforts. He serves as a faculty member in Biomedical Informatics, and he's been our clinical champion for our COVID-19 registry. And he's going to talk about our efforts to map this manual clinical registry into the OMOP data model. Matt.
Thank you, Paul. Normally when I speak to a group of clinicians, I'm trying to convince them why we should use OMOP. I don't have to convince this group of that. So I'm going to try to walk you through, the challenges of adapting this manual registry by focusing on just a single variable. But when you first approach this problem of adapting a manual registry to OMOP, as Paul mentioned, you've got to first evaluate the feasibility for each variable. How hard is it going to be to include it? As you approach this, you need to figure out what is the challenge versus the value added for each one of those variables that require extra effort. And to do that, you really need to consider the use case from the very beginning. And sometimes you need to identify alternative means of representing the data for these more complex variables rather than reaching in to extend the lexicon. And if there are difficult variables, if you want to do this in multiple sites, I think it's important to make sure you develop reproducible protocols so that it can be transformed similarly at each site. Next slide. So I'm going to focus on this variable, the WHO scale for COVID-19. It goes from 0 to 10 or 0 to 8, depending on how you look at it, going from the uninfected through the deceased. And it's a measure of how sick you are with COVID. Now, if you actually look for this variable, you won't find it as structured data in the EMR, and you don't usually find it documented clearly in notes. If you look here on the right, next slide, you'll see that grading ambulatory mild disease requires knowledge of whether a patient is symptomatic or not, which would require NLP. It also includes variables that are not usually included in an OMOP ETL. Click next slide. Such as respiratory support device. And when you dive further into that, you realize that some modes of respiratory support lack standard terms. Next slide. For example, non-invasive ventilation. I spent a lot of time poring over the SNOMED, and you won't find anything that accurately represents non-invasive ventilation. And another variable says such fraction of inspired oxygen, not typically present. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we need to consider from the beginning the use case. So we need to figure out, is this really important? So let's say you have a patient that has an oxygen saturation of 95%. You can just go next slide quickly. Receives drug X and survive. So you compare him to another patient who had an oxygen saturation of 95%. But then you realize that this patient died. So what's your conclusion? Drug X saves lives. Now let's look a little bit deeper. If we didn't have information on respiratory support device, you would think that patient A and B are appropriate to compare. But patient A on the left is not that sick. Patient B is on a ventilator, but with supplemental oxygen, his oxygen is measured at 95%. So these erroneous conclusions can really make observational data not usable for its intended purpose. You can hit next slide a few times. So this WHO scale is really the inclusion criteria and endpoint for many COVID-19 trials. So we really do need this variable. You can go next slide a couple times. So we really do need this to make sure we're comparing patients of equal severity. And if we don't get this right, you can misinterpret the data and get erroneous conclusions like, hydroxychloroquine saves lives. Go next slide. So let's take another look at this, the feasibility. So we've identified that, there can be significant effort to use this variable, but let's go back to the use case and our needs. When we speak to the other clinicians and investigators, we realize that they really just want to use this for inpatient drug repurposing. So inpatients aren't graded by the presence or absence of symptoms. So if we focus on just 4 through 10, we drop the need for NLP. Then it looks like we actually really do need to get the respiratory support modality, and that's documented in flow sheets, which is a challenge. So let's go look at that next. So wading through the flow sheets is something that I think most informaticists try to avoid at all costs because it's ugly. They're highly customized to individual deployments. The context of the flow sheet entry matters, whether a patient's in the OR or if it's entered by a medical student or a nurse. What we've found, though, is there is a way to protocolize this and make it reproducible. And so what we found is first, we need to find the flow sheet entries that contain the data of interest. And so if we looked at just the names of the flow sheets, examples would be there on the right. They're not real ones, but you'll see that they'll vary so much between institutions, difficult. But if we have some idea of what values it may contain, that may allow us to find them more easily. So then you end up with a source to concept map that must be customized at each site, but with protocols, it can be made reproducible. So this is the journey that we've taken.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. And so one of our goals has been, so we've actually been working on a pilot. We've done a pilot now with one of our, with the Prisma Health system, and we were able to help them move from 0 to OMOP and able to accelerate them in that process. So now, yeah, we decided we wanted to bring in some of the device data. So we have a delta for additional custom elements. But now we want to try to figure out how do we help them in their ETL journey of using proprietary EHR data and moving it into the OMOP format. And so one of the things we're excited about is we were, as part of this project, we were able to invest in the Perseus project, which is a great piece of software that was developed by Arcadia and Software Country. We were able to get, it's an open source one-stop ETL web tool. I'm hoping that this becomes our Atlas for ETL, just like we use Atlas for all of our analysis sites, having a one-stop tool that incorporates Rabbit in the Hat, White Rabbit, Usagi, all the other tools around it for uncoded terminology, for coded terminologies, to be able to bring that into a standardized place for tracking how we do our transformation in a standardized way. And we was really exciting as part of this project. We've created the OHDSI GitHub org of Perseus into OHDSI GitHub in July, and it's been an incredibly active project over the past couple of months. The Arcadia team has been incredibly responsive for issues that we've been working on, and we've been able to deploy that through the generosity of Microsoft on the Azure cloud. So it's been really an exciting partnership to be able to demonstrate this, trying to get this product to be able to be usable within health systems. And one of our goals is to create a base configuration for common EHRs for base EHR systems. So if you have Epic or Cerner, or a common EMR, the truth is you shouldn't have to go from 0 to OMOP. You should be able to start at like 60% of the way there, if not 70% of the way there, with a base configuration. These all come from usually common tables between institutions. There are going to be some parts of the tail that need to be configured, but you shouldn't have to start from 0. You should be able to take a base configuration and move from there. And this is an exciting opportunity to be able to leverage the Perseus platform to do that. And to demonstrate our work with Perseus, we have Zachary Wang, who will be presenting. He is currently a master's student at Johns Hopkins in our Biomedical Informatics and Data Science program, and he's also one of our own OHDSI Kheirons. And so, Zach, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction. So as I get started up with this demonstration, I just want to reiterate that the big idea to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through this is lowering cost, lowering burden. This is the entire purpose of the Perseus project. And as Paul mentioned, it is on Azure. So I'm going to just go to my web browser, and it really is as simple as going to the URL. This is currently a closed beta, but it will be opening within the coming weeks, and it is just an institutional login. So that I'm logging in with my Johns Hopkins account, and that actually allows me to access the Perseus site. So as it's pulling up, we're in. There's zero setup involved on the user side. It is really that simple of just getting into the ETL process. So at the very first step, one of the benefits that Perseus offers is this visual mapping. So it is really designed for a clinical use that you don't necessarily have to be a data expert in that sense to get the ETL working. And as we see this UI that we come in here, we have our source columns and our source tables, and then our destination table. So these source columns and source tables are what the data is in-house. This is what the site that we're dealing with has at hand and that they want to map to the OMOP common data model. So we see here we have 3 different options to import. This load new report references the White Rabbit reports if you've used that OHDSI tool before. We can also scan CSV files or hook up to a Postgres server. Or we can do this third option that I'll get into a bit later, which is opening an ETL mapping that has already been saved and configured for you. But for now, for this for this demonstration, I've already prepared some CSV files. So what I'm doing is I'm just going into my computer, my desktop, and opening some CSVs. And what this is doing is just importing the actual schemas and the column layouts for these for this data. So we're going to link the tables, and we can see here we have these 2 tables, and these are the columns that are featured within those tables. So these are just for demonstration purposes. But we have like an address line, we have a birthday column, we have just some patient identifier, and some other dummy data. And then when we're mapping to the OMOP common data model, the most common version for now is still version 5.4. So I click this, and we can see here that we have all of these destination tables created for us. And if you're not super familiar with the common data model, the most important ones are typically person, provider, and or condition occurrence. But there's so many like UI features that allow you to just filter and search, and really the mapping is as simple as dragging and dropping. So this is saying that I want to take this initial demo table, and I want to take some of the columns, and that was what's mapping into the actual person destination table within the OMOP common data model. And if I double click here, we go into a bit of a closer zoom in of here are all the destination columns, and here are all the destination or the source columns. And when we're doing our mappings, it really is just drag and dropping. So I've taken this identifier and I want to map to this person source value as well as this person ID. These are the integral columns that are needed for actual mapping. And it also has the typing. So we see that our source value is an integer, and we want to map to a variable character and an integer. So there is just a certain amount of dragging and dropping that can be done, and you can always just cancel that particular mapping if you don't want it. But for an example like this, we have an integer, but we want to map to a variable character. Something that we can do is just add any more amount of custom SQLization. If you know SQL, if you know Postgres, syntax is the exact same. So if you're familiar in one, you should be familiar in the other. So this is just a very quick mapping that says, hey, change it to the different type, and it maps in. And so we can just map all of these different things into the destination columns, and then that gives us a couple of options of what we can do now that we have that. The first is if you already have a Databricks environment, a Spark SQL environment, that this actually automatically generates the SQL necessary that we did with the drag and drop. So if you want to run it in a separate environment, you can feel free to do so. So there is no coding on my end, but it manages to generate this SQL code. Secondarily, you could generate a report. So this report is a White Rabbit report. It's a nice formatted Word document you can open up, and it just tells you, this is more so for documentation and sharing, but it tells you how each column is mapped, if any function is used, and that sort of thing. But then the final and most important thing is that we can actually run the ETL process within Perseus itself. You don't need to go to a separate SQL server or MySQL or anything. You can actually go to the CDM, direct to CDM. And so we have a bunch of different options for hooking up our source. If we have data on hand that resembles what we had as our input, we can do that. For now, I'm just going to do fake data. I'm just going to do like 5 rows. And I actually have an Azure server set up that I should be able to hook up. And this is just my login that I have set up for my Azure account. And as I'm doing this, we can actually see that it generates the actual test data. And once it's generated the test data, we can actually hook up to the server. It's connected, and this should actually just run. And it does this ETL process where it generates this fake data, where it pulls from your source database. It does any of the SQL that we specified, and it pushes it to the destination server. And now it's done. And if I can pull up my Azure real quick, we should see there's a bit of a latency with the server. Okay. I'm going to skip that for now for my single server login. but it actually does push and write to the server. And so this part is ready to ship. This is working. And that is the very first instance of what we can do. And obviously, there's some other very common ETL processes that we've had added into it. There's a lot of GUI and streamlining that is done as a very visual aspect. So for instance, one of the more common things involves is like for location or for a lot of different tables, you want to map multiple columns into that same table, and you can do so. This is a very common occurrence that you want to maybe combine two different columns together so we can actually coalesce, which just means combine the two. So what this is really saying is we take the first one as the default, and if this first column is blank or empty or void, ignore it and just use the second one as a backup. And so that is implemented as well. That is one of the most common occurrences. There's plenty of other things that are just very short, very intuitive things to streamline the ETL process. And at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, because I said focusing on lowering the cost, lowering the burden for this ETL process, even with these little shorthands, it still feels like I'm still doing the ETL process on a one-to-one basis. And you guys see that? That's like, this is really isn't super useful, but I would say like, hey, that's partially correct. And I will also say thank you for segueing into the next part of this presentation, which is that yes, you do have to do this one-to-one mapping, but you only have to do it once on the fundamental basis that once this is done, what we can do is actually go in here and save this mapping. So this is just a demo mapping, and this saves as a custom .etl file. So I'm going to save it here. And what this does is that with this demo.etl is if I want to send this to a site that wants to OMOPify their data, that wants to do this ETL process, all they have to do is also go to this Perseus instance and open up the mapping, pull up this ETL file, and then everything that I just did on my end has already been cached and sent to them. So all of these files, all of these SQL functions are built in. And so that really is one of the points that Paul touched on earlier. And I think one of the biggest strengths of Perseus is that the ideal workflow is that someone who is familiar with the OMOP common data model, who knows about the ETL process, is a bit more data oriented, knows a lot of the data munging aspects, can do 60, 70, 80% of the work, get it all done within a particular ETL file. And then for every Epic instance, for every Cerner instance, we just send them that default configuration, and then they're most of the way there. And then the only differences that they have to do is like go into it, maybe change some of the names of the column, maybe change some of the functions. There is also a feature where you can create and combine SQL in a bit longer or a bit more elaborate joins and other SQL functions. You can do that like this. And then that just runs. So you have a third table. You can make tables all within Perseus. But the whole idea is really that you can offload a lot of the work to people who are not clinical, but much more technically oriented, so that the clinical people don't have to learn about this, don't have to deal with a lot of the blocking aspects of the ETL process. And I just really want to iterate that this is such a huge jump in terms of the shareability, the interoperability, that as we continue to get more and more registries on the OMOP common data model, working through Perseus, testing with Perseus, it amortizes this cost, because each hour they spend on their work and each hour we spend on our work as the OHDSI community, it makes the next mapping process that much easier. All right, pause right there. And I think that the third thing that I really want to touch on, and this is much more of a pleasant surprise that we discovered in the with the Arcadian Microsoft team, that they have been doing such a great job at compartmentalizing and containerizing a lot of the technology within Perseus. So without skipping over some of the tech stack, this is all hosted within a singular Azure instance. And Lee Evans is speaking after me, and he's much more experienced and knowledgeable about the subject matter. But the idea of containerization and DevOps and deployment has made huge leaps and bounds with the Perseus project as well. And so we can actually see that right here. So we have these two different tabs. And this tab is vocabulary, and this is a containerized version of Athena that has just been built into the Azure instance. You can explore and look into all the different things. And so I was working with Dr. Robinson, and I wanted to look at, I spelled ventilator wrong. So if we want to look at the different vocabularies and different codings for that, we can do this all within a particular instance of Perseus. We don't have to go to the actual Athena website and download the vocabularies and get that set up with a browser. We can just do it all within this Azure server. It's all online. It's all done for you in terms of setup. And at the same time, we also have Usagi built in completely from scratch. So for those who aren't as familiar with Usagi, this is what it used to look like. So this is the older version of Usagi. It is a Java application. It takes maybe 1.5 to 2 hours to set up in terms of package running and some jar files. And basically what this does is allows you to map the vocabulary and the codings, the unstructured encodings of your source data into the OMOP common data model equivalent. And it's clunky, but it works. It gets the job done. But the phenomenal thing was that it is very common. We highly recommend its use of Usagi early on in the ETL process as an exploratory and getting that like source columns mapped. And the Arcadia and Microsoft teams, as everyone else who works on this project, has done a great job at just putting that into Perseus completely online. No setup necessary. And so as a quick demo, we're going to go in, and then I have this CSV file that has a couple of different blood measurements. We have like O2, we have albumin, partial flow, and that sort of stuff. And so all we're doing is we're selecting these. And I say I want to select by standard concepts, and I want them to be measurements. And what this is doing is that it'll do a different algorithm on edit distance and other text similarities that maps in as it's running. And what this is going to do is generate a reference table, a source to concept reference table that can be incorporated within Perseus very easily. And so this is the third thing that, again, Lee will speak on a bit more of, like the next step for deployability and ease of use for a lot of these OHDSI tools. So you can see here, some of them are better matchings than others. So we have like O2 and blood. That's perfect. We have CO2 and the artery. It's somewhat similar. Oxygen gas, neutrophil count, lymphocyte count, some of these things. And then we can look through these and approve them. I'd say like, yeah, these all look good. We'll keep these. Maybe not this one. So we're just going to exclude that. And as we save it, we have the saved source to concept vocabulary. And what we can do is when we go back here, and let's say we want to go into conditions, we have this condition. This would represent what we have on hand. So that would say like, maybe we don't have FiO2 as the particular code for on-house, for in-house. What we can do is we can map it to the condition occurrence ID. And then, oh, that's the wrong one. I should say it's condition source value. And then we can have a lookup table. And so what this lookup table is there's a bunch of pre-built ones, especially. So there's LOINC, there's ICD-10, ICD-9, where it just generates the SQL that automatically translates, oh, you have these codes in-house. Why don't we reference this table and then translate? And then we have all of these, but you can also just edit it to be code that we generated. Oops. Yeah. And so what this does is it just applies that particular mapping, and that just drastically streamlines the ETL process even further. So yeah, just to reiterate, we have this visual aspect where you don't really need to know SQL, although it does benefit you a lot. There's a lot of customization, a lot of possibilities to explore within Perseus. We have this saving and amortizing costs, and we also have this like kind of amorphous future steps of putting more stuff on Azure instances, putting more stuff online in containers that just allows deployments and just to hit the ground running significantly faster. I think I am decently on time, but I think I will hand it off.
Thanks, Zach. As you can tell, Zach's been having a lot of fun on the Perseus platform, and you can use it now. It is open source, is on GitHub. We want you to use it, and it really is an exciting platform. our next step was, how do we get these tools like Perseus into health systems that maybe don't have the same level of system administrations or ability to support custom platforms like academic health systems do? And that really is something that we really need to be able to get Atlas and Hades and all of our great tools into these environments. And so that's really been the second part or the third part of our project. And it really it's incredibly helpful to have these tools, as everyone knows, about data quality, and visualizing it with Achilles helps you understand any continuity issues with the data. And of course, my quest is it also helps them get greater value out of Odyssey within that health system. And so the CureID invested into the Odyssey Broad-C project, which is really which has been helping build generalized containers. And we are really grateful for Microsoft's partnership. They've really been committed to the open source way, and everything is going into our open source GitHub repos. And we're really hoping to see Amazon and Google also being able to support Perseus within their Odyssey stacks. And so, but today we have been able to implement this on the Azure environment. And to present that, and a lot of it is also how do we ensure, a lot of health systems that we talk to, they say, they're concerned about using open source software because of security compliance and getting through their enterprise IT. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Lee Evans, who is also a past Titan of Odyssey and is the owner of the LTS Computing, to help us understand how to lower the deployment burden with the cloud. Lee?
Thanks, Paul. So I wanted to just sort of give some context to the different components, different pieces that make up this solution. So I think of it in two different layers. So there's all the infrastructure pieces, the networking, the application servers, the databases. And then on top of that, you have what we really want, which is all the applications. So we saw Perseus. Zach did a great demonstration of Perseus. I always enjoy seeing that. And so we have Atlas, RStudio, and Hades. And so I got a couple of slides. I want to have a slide on each of those different pieces of software, just to set, give some background on what they are and what's provided as part of the solution. So there's two aspects in deploying this. One aspect is to deploy the infrastructure on the cloud, and we have a couple of options for that. And then the other aspect is, how do we deploy all the software and all the different pieces and components that make up that software? So next slide. Great. So this is Perseus. So this is another look at a way of thinking of Perseus, just in terms of the process involved. So these are the different steps, from starting with an initial database and converting it into the OMOP common data model. And it sort of goes anti-clockwise around here. I won't go into the details of it, but I just wanted to show how Perseus is incorporating a lot of the existing open source Odyssey toolset and putting a nice front end, making it really much easier to use, and packaging all that up. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Sergey Samus and his team at Arcadia. They've done a really good job of making all these different tools integrated into one new application. Next slide. Now, also, as part of the solution, we've got the Odyssey Hades R packages, and there's a whole Odyssey team that supports all of this, is constantly innovating. So you can see there's a number of packages here, but also behind these packages is all the different sort of technologies around it. So there's Python, there's R, C++. There's a whole sort of stack of technology behind these different packages and analytics, and we want to support all that. And it's a very complex one, it's a very advanced set of solutions, really. So there's a whole book about it. I just wanted to call out, there's an open source book, the Book of Odyssey, where you can look into all these analytics packages. Next slide. And of course, we have Atlas and Cohort Designer. So a lot of work done by Odysseus and J&J and lots of other individual contributors to make this application. Again, a lot of different technologies that go into it. And so what I wanted to do was sort of break out all those technologies and see how we package them all up together to make it much easier to install. So this screenshot just highlights one of the benefits of Atlas as well, that you can get characteristics of your database. And so maybe for some folks, this might be the first time they get a view of what their data really looks like. And that just comes with all these, the tools that we're delivering. Okay, so I haven't defined what a Docker container is, but essentially it's just a way of packaging up all the different software and its dependencies, all the pieces that it needs to work. So I thought it might be nice to sort of break apart a Docker container for one of the tools. So the Broadsea web tools containers Atlas, really the Atlas application that's been packaged up. And so if we start from the bottom, foundation, like number one on the right there. So there's different things at just a very low level. There's things that make Java work, JavaScript connecting to your database. And then if we go up a level, there's a Java application, and there's an Apache Tomcat server that you might want to use. And then above that is the rest of the the user interface, web user interface piece. So it's possible to install Atlas with all these separate pieces, but it's a lot easier to install it as a packaged Docker container. So if you have the Docker engine installed on your computer, it could be a server, it could be on a laptop, then it's possible then to just pull down an image from a public repository. So the Docker Hub, which is public, available to everyone. You can pull down the images and then use something called Docker Compose, which just starts up the different Docker images, and you end up with a working, running Atlas. So I wanted to get all of these latest versions of the images out there today, but I wasn't really able to do it. They'll be out there sometime before the end of this week. But I did put out today the OHDSI Broadsea Hades package. So that's going to be a significant new Docker image that's available for people who want to run RStudio and the Hades packages. All right, so there's a big headline there. Oh, just one last piece on that other slide. There's a big headline, 0 to Atlas in 10 minutes. It really is 10 minutes. And in actual fact, once I have this available, I'll put it in the forums when it's available. You actually only need to do the git clone to pull down the script and then Docker Compose up, and it will start up Atlas. And one other thing that's new is that I've created a Postgres database container called Broadsea Eunomia, which has everything set up for Atlas. So it has a Eunomia data set, which is synthetic data, very small data set, a very small set of vocabulary data to support that, and then all the different tables and components that you need to get Atlas up and running. So that really is going from 0 to Atlas without any other necessary configuration. Okay, so Broadsea's been out there for a while. It's a project around creating packaged applications using Docker. And what's new in this new version? It's new enough to be called Broadsea 2.0. So we've got security, so open source. So again, all these tools are open source, and Broadsea needs to be the same. So the scripts that generate these Docker containers is going to be out there on open source on GitHub under the OHDSI repos. We're doing Docker image scanning for common vulnerabilities and exposures. So we're going to look at all the different components within these images and talk to the different teams that produce them, so we can ensure that we have secure images. If we see CVEs, that they get addressed. And then the last part is another thing that's new is we're going to be signing these containers. So you can optionally have Docker verify an image before it runs an image. And so for the first time, you'll be able to verify that this image came from OHDSI. It'll be signed by OHDSI. The second piece here is around versioning metadata. So one thing that's new is we're going to have versions retained for all different containers. So you'll be able to go back to a previous version of Broadsea Hades if you want to run a study, or you had a study code that needs a particular version of Hades. You'll be able to do that, which is a big plus. Yeah, we haven't quite got to the point where we got the automated build yet, but I'm working on that. So very soon we'll have GitHub Actions. So we'll have a nightly build of these images to keep them up to date. That's also a key piece, and it'll go through the testing and the scanning piece. And the last piece on here is just that we have new images coming out. So Broadsea Web Tools has always been there. It's not changing. We're going to have it signed. Broadsea Hades is new, and I just put it out there this morning. So it has the RStudio server, it has all the Hades R packages, which I showed you that slide earlier, and it's going to be a replacement for Broadsea Web Methods. And it's built based on the definitions of the Hades packages that the Hades team produce. So it will pull in whatever packages are part of Hades as they grow out, and it'll have much less of a maintenance burden than some of the other images I've seen out there. I mentioned the Postgres database preloaded with Eunomia synthetic data. So you can have something to start off with. And I think the other aim there is that if you don't have a Postgres database to use with Atlas, you'll be able to use that one and then link over to your own CDM. Okay, so the last piece here. So I talked about the top layer with all the applications and the Docker containers. The lower layer is all the infrastructure. So we have different options for how you can get that infrastructure. And this is more something for your IT team, local IT team, to probably talk to your Microsoft account person and have those groups talk about this. So this is kind of very technical, but there's been a lot of work done by Microsoft and Corey Stevenson and his team in particular to simplify, to script the infrastructure in the cloud. So if you're using Azure, you'll be able to go to a GitHub. It'll execute a script which will generate all the correct cloud infrastructure, all the networks, the applications, databases, and then it'll build and launch those Broadsea Docker containers, and you'll be able to download your OMOP vocabulary data and load it into the database, and you're up and running. So as Paul mentioned, there are other options. Just real quick, Odyssey on AWS is an existing open source solution from AWS. It doesn't have Perseus yet, but we'd like to get that added to it. And then we're also looking to produce a similar solution with Google, on their cloud platform. Okay, thanks, Paul.
Lee, thank you so much. And so I just wanted to share. So for our first pilot results, we actually worked with Prisma Health, and we didn't have the Perseus tool at the time, but we were able to share our ETL scripts with them. We were able to help guide them through the process, and we found that, when I mentioned that $150,000 of mapping from 0 to OMOP, that's roughly about 1,000 hours worth of time of someone to help you with the data mapping. We were able to do that with the data analysts at Prisma Health in under 200 hours, which we thought was a great improvement in their efficiency. And we're hoping that with Perseus, we can get even farther efficiencies in reducing that burden. And so I did want to mention that CureID is actually still recruiting sites to implement Perseus. And so if you're interested in getting help, you can deploy it yourself. Or as part of this registry, you're welcome to join and expand. And also, this registry is expanding beyond COVID to include meningitis and sepsis. And so, if you want more information, please follow the link below. If you want to see some of the data, we actually de-identify all the data before we send it to the registry. All of our scripts for de-identification are in the Odyssey repo for CureID registry. And we only have a few minutes left, and I apologize to Emily. So I wanted to include more than just the CureID registry. There's many registries out there that are making a real impact on the Odyssey community. And N3C in particular is one that has actually done several things that I think has been really valuable for us as a community. The N3C has done a lot of work on, actually since they've been able to collect a lot of data on unit level harmonization. They've done tremendous work on how you do open governance to create common phenotypes. They've done great work on actually how to incorporate negative controls as part of recruitment criteria to be able to bring in negative controls into the registry. And Emily was going to talk about how they're actually even taking advantage of acyclic graphs and distributed machine learning using OMOP. And so, Emily, I don't know if you want to just mention that in the next couple of minutes, but it almost deserves its own week to talk about all the contributions N3C is making to the Odyssey community.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think that it would probably take more than the few minutes that we have left to describe the effort in detail, but I would be happy to come back another time to talk about how we can share machine learning models across OMOP repositories and really hasten the speed of particularly machine learning-based phenotyping science using OMOP. So happy to come back another time.
Thank you, Emily. And so what I'm hoping you use today is if you're part of a clinical registry, you can point them to this video, or you can ask them why aren't they using OMOP, because I really feel like we need to raise the conversation with clinical registries to help really reduce the burden on our health system in this data collection process. I think it creates a great opportunity for us to create better efficiencies. And of course, it really adds to the network effect of our great OHDSI data partners, which has over 200 health systems in it already. And so I feel like this is a win-win for our community, as well as really helping out the field of clinical registries and even potentially clinical trials. Alrighty, Craig, thank you so much. Back to you.